Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this morning's event entitled Raising Ambition on Ending Wildlife Crime, the Benefits of a New Global Agreement, which forms part of the proceedings of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime's 31st meeting of the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, or CCPCJ, and is coming to you from the Vienna International Centre in Austria. My name is Mark Jones. I'm a veterinarian and I work as head of policy for the UK-based wildlife protection NGO Born Free. And I'm here in Austria as an observer at the CCPCJ meeting. Born Free is a founding member of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, and I'm honoured to have the opportunity to host this side event on its behalf. As has been recognised by the United Nations General Assembly in no less than 5 previous resolutions, illicit wildlife trafficking contributes to the extinction risk facing many species, negatively impacts ecosystems and their ability to sequester carbon, poses a threat to national and regional stability, undermines good governance and the rule of law, and increases the likelihood of zoonotic disease emergence. Yet there is currently no global agreement on tackling this problem. In recognition of this, the governments of Angola, Kenya, and Peru have submitted a draft resolution to this CCPCJ meeting entitled Strengthening the International Legal Framework for International Cooperation to Combat and Prevent Illicit Trafficking in Specimens of Wild Fauna and Flora. This timely draft resolution calls on the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and its member states to examine the challenges and gaps in the current international legal framework for preventing and combating illicit trafficking in wildlife, and to consider the pros and cons of developing an additional protocol under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime or other possible mechanisms to address those gaps in order to strengthen international criminal justice cooperation for preventing and combating illicit trafficking in wildlife. So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to introduce a panel of 4 distinguished speakers this morning who will be discussing the importance of tackling illicit wildlife trafficking and the merits of the proposed resolution. Before I do, just some brief housekeeping. We are recording this event for possible publication on the UNODC website. I'll invite each of our speakers to speak for something like 5 to 8 minutes, and we'll follow the talks with a brief question and answer session. Speakers, please keep your microphone switched off if you're not speaking to reduce any background noise. We only have a total of 50 minutes allocated to us for this event, so I respectfully ask our speakers to please try and keep to time. And if audience members have questions they would like to pose to our panelists, please post them in the Q&A function, and we'll try and cover as many as possible in the time we have available. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Cecilia Silva. Cecilia is Director for Cooperation at the Ministry of Culture, Tourism and Environment of the Government of Angola, and she's going to provide us with an introduction to the draft resolution. Cecilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good morning to everyone who is joining us online today. Thank you for being with us. Mark, I'm pleased to take part of this important side event on behalf of the government of Angola, and again, I thank you for inviting us. After an intense week of negotiations of our draft resolution, which is strengthening the international legal framework for international cooperation to combat and prevent illicit trafficking in specimens of wild fauna and flora. My country, Angola, has some of the richest and most diverse wildlife resources of any country in Africa, with iconic species, unique biological diversity, and landscapes. If left unaddressed, the illicit trafficking of wildlife threatens to strip Angola of these precious sovereign resources and of the opportunity for its people to prosper from their sustainable use. So for this reason, Angola submitted this draft resolution to the 31st session of the CCPCJ alongside with Kenya and Peru. and the draft resolution has since then been co-sponsored by a number of other countries, including Ecuador, Gabon, Ghana, Honduras, and Malawi, countries that we thank very much for this support to Angola. This draft resolution followed the strong statement made by Angola's president, His Excellency João Lourenço, in September 2022, calling for the adoption of a new global agreement on illicit wildlife trafficking in the form of an additional protocol under the UNTAC. The presidents of Costa Rica, Gabon, and Malawi also made similar statements and equally powerful statements. I was proud to see so many source countries lead the way on such a critical issue alongside with Angola. Source countries rich in biodiversity are feeling the full brunt of illicit wildlife trafficking and all of its implications. Organized criminals are depriving our countries of precious natural resources. They exacerbate corruption and regional instability, frustrate our efforts to preserve wildlife for future generations, and pose a serious risk of public health. I'm proud to say that after weeks of hard negotiations, the text of our draft resolution has made significantly good progress and will hopefully reach consensus later today. The latest version of the draft resolution calls on the UNODC to collect member states' views on possible responses to tackle illicit trafficking in wildlife, including an additional protocol under the UNTAC. The government of Angola strongly feels that now is the time to advance this conversation to the next stage. In the upcoming months, member states will be able to express their views on a new global agreement on illicit wildlife trafficking and make constructive suggestions on how the current international framework can be strengthened. I think the global initiative to end wildlife crime for organizing this important side event, which is so relevant in the context of our draft resolution, and look forward to listening to the experts' opinions of today's panelists. And thank you personally, Mark, and my colleagues, panelists for this, for finding time to join you to pass this important message, which is the resolution we are trying to achieve here, to adopt here, and hopefully we can do today. I wish you all fruitful discussion, and I apologize myself to have to leave because we are just starting informal consultations to continue our work on the draft resolution. Thank you all, and a good day to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Cecilia, and particularly for joining us after what was a very late night last night of negotiations. We fully appreciate everything that you're doing on behalf of this resolution and on behalf of Angola. And we wish you all the best with the negotiations today. And let's hope for a very positive outcome later today. Thank you very much
for doing your part for this fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Adrian Reuter. Adrian is a wildlife biologist focusing over the past 3 decades on legal and illegal wildlife trade issues in Latin America. A senior advisor on illegal wildlife trade and counter wildlife trafficking for Latin America and the Caribbean as part of the Wildlife Conservation Society. He is supporting strategies and projects aimed at generating and strengthening capacities, information, and cooperation among relevant stakeholders to improve implementation of legal frameworks and more effectively combat illegal trade of species of wild origin in this region. Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you see the screen correctly? Great. Well, Thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation. It's a pleasure to be in this panel with so knowledgeable people on this very important topic. And also to share some thoughts from the Latin American perspective, being this one of the most biodiverse regions globally, whose natural resources, including wildlife, are of the utmost importance for the livelihoods of millions of people who depend directly or indirectly on these. With such a vast biodiversity, wildlife has been used and traded both legally and illegally over time, but existing trends demand urgent actions before it is too late for many directly or indirectly affected taxas, such as many amphibians, turtles, cetaceans, or felids like the jaguar. Latin America and the Caribbean countries have been historically perceived as source countries of such specimens, but it is important to recognize that most are not only source countries for wildlife specimens, but also transit and destination countries as well. So IWT, illegal wildlife trade, exists at a local, national, and regional levels, but also on a transcontinental level and increasingly to Asia, under a scenario which, as in other parts of the world, includes corruption, laundering, and other associated crimes. As an expanding crisis threatening global biodiversity, wildlife trafficking can cause species extinctions and extirpations, landscape and ecosystem destruction, disrupt livelihood, and cost millions in lost revenue for local economies. A good example of this is Belize, a very small country with 500,000 people in Mesoamerica, highly dependent on its natural resources for income generation, such as tourism, fisheries, agriculture, forestry, as well as for basic needs, such as food, medicine, housing, materials, etc. And as can be seen in the results of a recent study by WCS between 2012 and 2018, it is estimated that Belize lost a minimum of 61 million Belizean dollars from the illegal trade of game species, conch, lobster, timber, rosewood, and mahogany particularly, sharks and parrots, which is likely to be a gross underestimation of the trade given that information is so scarce. Now, the extent of illegal wildlife trade varies from country to country and region to region within Latin America and the Caribbean. It includes CITES and non-CITES listed species, and is certainly worth of attention. Just as an example, and based on an analysis undertaken by the Wildlife Conservation Society in the Andes Amazon region, more than 200,000 individuals from 914, more than 200,000 individuals from 914 wild vertebrate species were confiscated in Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, and Brazil between 2010 and 2018. The most common species encountered on seashores include freshwater turtles, cetacean and songbirds, amphibians, some mammals, and other species such as the jaguar. Of particular concern are species whose trade has increased exponentially over the past few years and lack sufficient and effective controls and might not be listed in CITES, for example. One of these being the Matamata turtle, whose legal register exports can be seen in the slide, which went from like 749 individuals in 2010 up to over 18,000 individuals in 2018. So in places where, now it is one very important thing that I want to say is that in Latin America and the Caribbean, not all wildlife trade, not all wildlife trafficking and wildlife crime is organized crime, but some of it is particularly on high value taxa and commodities, such as the one that you can see in the slide, and timber species such as rosewood, cedar, mahogany, and others like marine specimens such as shark fins and sea cucumbers, or even live animals for the international food and pet markets, including endangered freshwater turtles or amphibians such as the dart frog in the picture. A protocol with a focus on wildlife crime under UNTOC can promote for countries in Latin America to not only consider wildlife crime as a serious crime and also undertaken by organized criminal groups, but for that to be reflected in their legal frameworks, which could allow for authorities responsible to tackle these illicit activities to strengthen coordination with other enforcement actors, access additional resources, and implement investigative and intelligence approaches currently only used for other serious crimes such as human trafficking, drugs trafficking, or gun trafficking. Such a protocol, by the way, would be in line with commitments made by countries in Latin America and the Caribbean to improve counter-wildlife trafficking actions and policies. For example, under the Lima Declaration, which was signed by 20 countries, if I recall correctly, as an outcome of the first high-level conference on illegal wildlife trade in the Americas in 2019 in Peru, many of who participated as a second high-level conference on IWT in the Americas in Cartagena, Colombia, just last month, showing progress on their efforts and renewing their willingness to continue in that path. So let me end with this. Sorry for my technical problems here, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Adrian, for that enlightening presentation. And thank you for joining us from Lima, Peru, where it is, I believe it is very late at night or perhaps very early in the morning with you. I hope you can stay with us for the Q&A session. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Sandra Altherr. Sandra is a biologist with almost 30 years of experience in wildlife conservation and is a co-founder of the German charity Pro Wildlife. She focuses on the analysis of wildlife trade and its impacts on biodiversity, including the many facets of wildlife trafficking. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark, and greetings to Vienna. I heard you have very long days for negotiations. So hello all. The topic of my presentation is to show different aspects of wildlife trafficking. So wildlife crime is a main threat to biodiversity. I think there is no doubt about this, but it is often handled as a trivial offense and not as a serious offense, although it is very often controlled and organized by criminal networks and syndicates. When you talk with journalists, with authorities, or even just with the family or friends about wildlife crime, people have in mind poaching of elephants, rhino horn, tiger bones, and maybe pangolins. So what we call the sexy species, but wildlife crime is much more than this. It is not at all limited to CITES species, but it also affects many species which are nationally protected in their range state. And it's not only a problem of the African and Asian region, which you could assume when you're just talking about tigers and elephants, but it's a global one and it has so many different aspects. My organization is based in Europe and we have a focus on the wildlife trade here in Europe, including the pet trade. And also, even in that business, there is much of illegal activities going on. And I chose two cases just to illustrate what I'm talking about. This tiny creature, which is not looking very spectacular, is one of the most highly sought after species in the exotic pet trade. And this is because it was thought to be extinct and it has a very unique biology. So the specialists are very much behind that. The biologists thought for decades that it is extinct, and when scientists found new populations in the wild and published their findings, only a few months later the first animals showed up in the European trade, and that was in 2014, and the prices were unbelievable. 10,000 euro per pair of these brown lizards. And what is the important point is that there was no legal export of the only two range states, Malaysia and Indonesia, ever, which means that all animals in trade in Europe were taken illegally and were smuggled out of the country of origin. And I chose this example because it shows the enormous profit margin for traffickers, which can be done with these creatures.
Sandra, I'm sorry to break in, but we can't see your slides.
None of that? Oh, gosh. That is a pity. Yeah. So maybe I just go back for one moment so you see the last one, just to know what I was talking about. Now you can see it, right? Great. Okay, that is the little brown lizard I was talking about. The second case is from Cuba, and Cuba has a high endemicity, which means as an island state, many of the wildlife species are only found in Cuba and nowhere else in the world. And commissioned by the German Environmental Ministry, we analyzed the exotic pet trade in Europe in 2018. And at that time, we recorded 18 lizard species in the pet trade, which shouldn't have been marketed because they are nationally protected in Cuba. And the prices of these animals were also astonishingly high, with up to 3,000 euro per lizard. Cuba at that time was not even aware that its living treasures were stolen. And after being alerted by us, they immediately requested a CITES Appendix 3 listing as an emergency step. But this case shows that the problem is that the range states often are not even aware what's going on, and the importing countries at the moment don't have a legal basis to act against this business as long as these animals are not protected under CITES. We have found many more examples, and in case you want to see more countries and species, just have a look into our stolen wildlife reports. This type of wildlife crime enables traders to legally sell illegally sourced non-CITES animals. And they can do it with a large profit range, but much lower risks than smuggling CITES species. This crime targets very rare species, many of them facing extinction. It undermines the conservation efforts of so many range states for thousands of nationally protected species around the world. And it tolerates and even rewards a highly criminal business. So what is the conclusion, and how can this problem be solved? The momentum is now for a new protocol under UNTAC, which would recognize wildlife crime as a serious offense, similarly high as trafficking of drugs and weapons. And we hope that the resolution tabled by Angola will be adopted this week, today in the plenary. And we wish you good negotiations and a good success for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Yes, it's sobering to realise we often focus on those species that do have protections under international regulations, but the trade and trafficking in those that don't so often falls under the radar. So thank you for bringing this really important issue to our attention. Our final speaker today is John Scanlon. John served as Secretary General of the CITES Secretariat between 2010 and 2018, and was founding chair of the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime in 2010. He then joined African Parks as its first special envoy from 2018 to 2020. John is now the CEO of the Elephant Protection Initiative Foundation, chair of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, and chair of the UK government's Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund. Over to you, John.
Great, thanks very much, Mark, and good morning all, and thank you to all of our speakers and to everyone who's joined us online today. Particular thanks to Cecilia Silva, the Director of Cooperation at the Ministry of Culture, Tourism and Environment of Angola, who has been in Vienna this week leading negotiations on behalf of Angola. It was a late night last night, and very appreciative that she found the time to join us this morning, and she's now back into informals. And as you know, Mark, I was there in Vienna with you for the first 3 days of this week. I've had to come back for family reasons, but it's wonderful to see the progress that is being made. And we look forward to seeing the final outcomes this afternoon when the Committee of the Whole concludes its work and passes on its work to the plenary session. Now, we're talking today about wildlife crime, illicit wildlife trafficking, and there are many things we need to do if we are going to effectively combat illicit wildlife trafficking. We have to deal with demand, we have to deal with supply, we have to work right across the illegal supply chain through source, transit and destination countries. We have to build the capacity of criminal justice systems. We have to have in place sound national and international laws and effective enforcement. So there's a lot that has to be done. But what we're focused on today is one critical component of that, and that is the international legal framework. The framework that, if you like, guides the development of national laws, that guides the development of cooperation between states as they tackle transnational organized crime. So that's what I'm focusing on today. And it's timely because, as you pointed out, and as Cecilia advised us, Angola, Kenya and Peru put forward a draft resolution this week to advance this discussion through the intergovernmental process, through the UN Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, that has now attracted a number of other co-sponsors, including Gabon and Malawi and many others that she mentioned. And these are all countries, as Cecilia pointed out, that are very rich in biodiversity. They're source countries, as Adrian pointed out, sometimes also destination and transit countries. But these are countries that feel the full brunt of illicit trafficking in wildlife and all the implications that go with it. So fingers crossed for a good outcome this afternoon. Now, why do we need to look at a new international legal instrument? Well, Mark, you've already pointed out in your opening remarks that we don't actually have in place any legal agreement that is in place to prevent and combat illicit trafficking in wildlife. Let's first just take a little bit of a look, and previous speakers have talked about this as well, as to what are the consequences of illicit trafficking in wildlife. And we're now in a position where we can draw upon multiple credible reports that give us an evidence base to understand what the full implications of illicit wildlife trafficking are. These are reports from the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the UN Environment Programme, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, the World Bank, and a number of other reports, including reports that Sandra was referring to. And what we see is that there are very severe consequences of trafficking in wildlife. And these consequences are for our climate, for our ecosystems, for individual species of wild animals and plants, for human and animal health, but more than that. These crimes involve the theft of vital natural resources from local and indigenous communities. They're also discouraging legitimate investment in countries. They're undermining the governments of source countries, their ability to generate revenue, and they're fueling corruption, they're destroying livelihoods, and injuring and killing rangers. Now, the World Bank put out a report. Not everybody likes this report, but this report was a groundbreaking report in terms of not just looking at the cost of the contraband, which when you look at all wildlife that's being trafficked is put at somewhere around $200 billion a year. But if you look at the actual impacts of illicit wildlife trafficking, what are the overall impacts of it, including the impacts on ecosystems, the loss of government revenue and more, the World Bank says that it estimates the actual cost of the impacts of illicit wildlife trafficking of all wild fauna and flora at a staggering figure of somewhere between $1 to $2 trillion a year. So I think you can see that this illicit wildlife trafficking is having massive implications. It is recognized as a crime that affects the environment, and there's a lot of work going on at the moment about crimes that affect the environment. It's not currently defined, but it is a crime that affects the environment, but it goes well beyond that. This is a crime that affects economies. This is a crime that affects livelihoods. This is a crime that affects national and regional security, a crime that affects public and animal health and more. Now, it's not as though nothing's been going on to try and tackle this illicit wildlife trafficking. There's been a lot going on. And I've had the opportunity to be quite closely associated with a lot of action taken to combat illicit wildlife trafficking since I joined CITES in 2010. And that included creating the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime, an interagency initiative of CITES Secretariat, Interpol, UN Office of Drugs and Crime, World Bank and World Customs to address these issues. We also saw multiple UN General Assembly resolutions on the issue of tackling illicit wildlife trafficking. The first one being in 2015. And I well remember Gabon and Germany were at the forefront of that initiative to have the first ever UN General Assembly resolution on tackling illicit trafficking in wildlife. We've also seen various resolutions of UN Environment Assembly, ECOSOC, of the Crime Commission itself, etc. But we're now in a position where we have a long history of many non-binding resolutions and declarations having been made. But the sad thing is we've not turned the corner with illicit wildlife trafficking. We continue to see wildlife trafficking escalate in many places. And also we're becoming more and more aware of the multiple consequences of this illicit trafficking in wildlife, which I've just outlined in terms of biodiversity, our climate, our health. And we've of the view, and this is a view that has been discussed quite extensively this week and in prior weeks, that the current international legal framework is inadequate. It's inadequate to provide the framework that we need to enhance cooperation amongst states in combating these serious transnational organized crimes. Now, sometimes we hear reference to CITES. CITES is a great instrument. I was Secretary General for 8 years. I'm very fond of the convention, but it's a trade-related convention. It's not a crime-related convention. It was never adopted as a convention to tackle transnational organized crime. It exists to regulate trade, to ensure that trade doesn't threaten the survival of the species that is in trade. And it regulates just 38,000 of the world's 8 million species, so 0.5% of the world's 8 million species. And it's not a forum for the criminal justice system, for prosecutors, for police, etc. It's a forum that has a different flavor. It's a forum that addresses issues to do with trade. So it's a good instrument, but it's an instrument that also needs to, I think, as Sandra said, very focus a lot more attention on how it's regulating the legal trade as well, because there are 1 million trade transactions a year under that convention. We do see misuse of permits. We see science that is inadequate. We see many things going with the convention. It really needs to focus its attention on how it is regulating trade and leave it for the entities that have been established to combat transnational organized crime to pick up issues to do with organized crime. So we have a framework, a sort of non-binding framework. We've seen a lot of things go on over many years, but we're not turning the corner. And that's why Angola, Kenya and Peru, now with other co-sponsors, has sought to initiate a conversation amongst states about the adequacy of the current legal framework, the gaps in that framework, and whether or not we should be contemplating now an additional protocol under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime dedicated to the issue of illicit trafficking in wildlife. And that resolution will be concluded today. A protocol addressing illicit trafficking in wildlife could do many things. The first thing is it would automatically trigger the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and all of the various mechanisms it has under that. At the moment, you can only trigger it by ensuring an offence carries a 4-year custodial sentence or more. When it comes to illicit trafficking in wildlife, one really wants to have a range of penalties. Those penalties may include community service orders, fines, restitution, compensation, as well as incarceration, and in some cases, very heavy sentences of incarceration, but you really need a range of penalties. And by having a protocol that the convention, the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, can be triggered immediately. But also a protocol can contain many provisions. It can define what conduct should be criminalized, and states would then agree what conduct should be criminalized. It can define what species it is to apply to, and it can apply to CITES listed or non-listed species, so it can apply to a much ranger array of species. It can deal with all sorts of issues about defining what these crimes are, as I said, the conduct, but also that it covers issues to do with taking, possession, purchase, sale. And for example, CITES doesn't deal with poaching. It could do some critical things like oblige states to make it a criminal offence to import any wildlife that has been taken contrary to national laws. So that it would be an offence just not in the source country, but an offence in the destination country. And that if you'd stolen wildlife from a source country, it was an offence to bring it in to a destination country. Many other things that could be done in terms of obliging states to verify documentation, to share information on known criminal groups. There could be issues to do with sharing forensics. There could be issues to do with the role of the carriers of contraband, and much more. So there are a lot of opportunities to embed within a protocol obligations that would be specifically directed towards these issues in combating, but also preventing obligations about demand reduction efforts, raising awareness, etc. So that's a brief snapshot, Mark, of where we are, why we need to take illicit trafficking in wildlife seriously, the inadequacies in our current international legal framework, the opportunities to explore an additional protocol, and just touching upon very briefly some of the elements that could be included if states chose to in a protocol. It would be a matter for them to negotiate. And we'll know by the end of today whether or not there is an appetite amongst states comprising the UN Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice to accept the draft resolution that's been put forward by Angola, Kenya and Peru, and now co-sponsored by so many others, including Gabon and Malawi, to initiate this conversation through an intergovernmental process, which would be a big step, would be the first time we've seen such a conversation initiated. So I commend the 3 states that have put this forward, all co-sponsoring states, and let's hope that other states, when they conclude their negotiations, find a way to achieve consensus and carry this critically important conversation forward. So with that, Mark, thank you very much for organising today, and thanks to everybody for joining us.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much for that really comprehensive run through where things are at an international level, and where some of the gaps are, and why we're here in Vienna at the moment trying to negotiate this particular resolution. So that's all of our speakers spoken. I'm just going to switch back to gallery view if I can, and if the speakers can turn their cameras back on. We'll move to the question and answer session. We have about 10 minutes left, and I have a number of questions which have been forwarded to me. So with your indulgence, I'd like to put some of these questions to the panel. The first question, which I'll address initially to John, if I can, is why the focus on illicit wildlife trafficking here at the CCPCJ, rather than a broader focus on wider environmental crimes, given that there's already a resolution on wider environmental crime that was passed a few months ago.
Thanks, Mark, and there's been a good conversation running on that this week, and certainly I've had very many constructive conversations with high-level representatives of France and others who have been very active in pursuing the issue of crimes that affect the environment. Crimes that affect the environment is an important issue. It's an issue that is being discussed under the framework of the Crime Commission, but also through the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime. The phrase is crimes that affect the environment. It's not yet defined. There's no yet agreed definition on what the range of crimes are that fall within that purview, although it's accepted that illicit wildlife trafficking is a crime that affects the environment, and quite naturally, we all know that it is. But To say that illicit wildlife trafficking is a crime that affects the environment is not to say that they're one and the same. One is a chapeau, if you like, to try and look at a whole suite of crimes. It could be issues to do with hazardous waste, illegal mining, illegal forestry, and also illicit wildlife trafficking. And we take a broad definition of trafficking to cover timber and fish. So there are a wide range, a yet to be defined range of crimes that can fit under that chapeau. But that's really trying to carry this issue forward to draw attention to these crimes, that they do have an effect on the environment, the importance of addressing them. But each of these crimes need to be also addressed in their own right. They're not all exactly the same. And illicit wildlife trafficking, we've heard earlier today about the World Bank putting a value on it of $1 to $2 trillion a year. It's something that has been addressed by the General Assembly 5 times since 2015 to 2021. It is a crime that has an effect on the environment, but it's not just having an effect on the environment. And this is something we've stressed since 2010. It has an effect on economies. It has an effect on society. We just saw in Benin 2 months ago, another 5 rangers killed in the field who are working in a protected area there for African parks. Has an impact on public health and animal health. We know now the links with zoonotic diseases. Has an impact on livelihood. So yes, it's a crime that affects the environment, but it is so much more than that. And it is at a point now, it is well recognized, well understood. We know that the international legal framework is inadequate. Now is the time to advance this particular discussion, as has been so eloquently put forward by Angola, together with Peru and Kenya this week and other times, that this crime deserves very serious attention in its own right. And it is a crime that affects the environment that is ready to be considered for inclusion as a protocol.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I hope that's clarified that particular question for our listeners. The next question, which I'll direct to Adrian, if I may, is why does the panel think that current international agreements and regulations on wildlife crime are not sufficient? Why do we need to go through this whole process?
Yeah, well, I think that was extensively covered by John in his presentation, but I would like to give one example, which I believe might be quite illustrative. Coming from the Latin American region and having just done a little tour to several countries looking at our projects to counter wildlife trafficking and capacity building for enforcement officials, it is clear if you look in many places, if you look at the enforcement people who is working against drug trafficking, against gun trafficking, and you see them and you can see the level of equipment, training, tools, and legal framework supporting their work. And then you compare it to what the officials and agents working towards countering wildlife trafficking have as tools, as resources available to do this activity. It's really sad to put it very bluntly. No, in some instances, the agents working in borders and on wildlife trade related issues, wildlife trafficking related issues, don't even have access to computers, to vehicles, to fuel, communications equipment, or even biosafety equipment. No, so this because it is not taken as a serious crime, it is not considered as something that the organized crime can undertake in many of the countries, and so the resources available to tackle other crimes are not available to them. So in order to tackle it from the basis, for example, if they want to undertake an investigation or do intelligence, like even basic things on this effort, such as control deliveries or intervening in telephones, is not even legally possible for them to do in case of trafficking of wildlife, which is something that in the case of trafficking of drugs or guns can be done in many countries because it is considered a serious crime and it is in the legislation. So in my opinion, if this protocol can catalyze the process for countries to not only consider this crime as a serious crime, but also for that to reflect in the legislation, to have the legal reforms that force this to happen, to invest resources I'm not even comparable, at least to invest sufficient resources for this crime to be tackled accordingly to the gravity, to its gravity. I think it would be very, very useful, and thus I think it should be something to be supported. So this, of course, there are other agreements like CITES, a trade agreement, but I think one of the key things that we see, at least from my Latin American perspective, is that the legal frameworks are not putting this type of crime, wildlife crime, at the level that it requires for the government officials in charge of tackling this to be able to do so under the current legislation. So for me, this is one of the key issues that I want to highlight, because I see it every day, and it's very disappointing that they want to do things, but they don't have the tools to do so, or the will, and that also elicits other types of crime, such as corruption, as one clear example, which is easy to understand.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Another question, which I'll direct to Sandra, if I may, kind of a similar question in a way. Why are national laws protecting species not enough to prevent international trafficking? And also, Sandra, working for an NGO, how can supporters within countries with perhaps skeptical governments advocate for this initiative to their leadership? Sandra.
Thank you. Yeah, we see the need for a legal basis for the importing countries as well, because they also have a responsibility to act against that specific wildlife crime. And such legislation, or stricter, a higher level of legislation, would enable them to penalize the import, the marketing and possession of stolen wildlife. So far, the USA is the only country which has such legislation. It's called US Lacey Act. And as I said in my presentation, the problem is that the range states often are not even aware what's going on, and the importing countries don't have legal tools to act against this. And that's why. And the second part of your question, I think that we need any support we can get to convince governments, also in the marketing countries, in the destination countries, to get active on this, because we all have a huge responsibility to conserve biodiversity and to avoid the plundering of nature.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And finally, I'd like to give our panelists, if I may, an opportunity just in 1 minute to sum up what they hope a global legal agreement on tackling wildlife crime will achieve for wildlife, biodiversity, and of course for people as well. So if I can put that question to each of the panelists in turn, starting with Adrian, if I can.
Yes, certainly. In my opinion, many countries, they have shown the political will to undertake actions, to undertake measures to combat wildlife trafficking. But political will is not the same as actions. So that political will should be turned into action. And for me, this protocol might catalyze the process in order for the will to be turned into actions in the field, into resources, into more efforts and better opportunities to tackle this huge threat to biodiversity.
Thank you, Adrian. The same question to Sandra, if I can.
Yeah, very brief. We hope for an increased awareness, stricter legislation, and higher penalties.
Thank you, Sandra. And John, to finish off.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, colleagues. Well, Mark, if a protocol was put into place, you would have a legally binding agreement in place that would act as a catalyst for the sort of legislative basis at a national level and the cooperation across borders that is required to end illicit wildlife trafficking. And we would see specific obligations there that were directed towards both preventing and combating these crimes, and you'd see a common approach to how you tackle them. That would be invaluable, and it really would, I think, as Adrian said, and pick up on Sandra as well, it would be a catalyst for action at a national level at a scale and in a manner that would enable us to finally turn the corner here.
Thank you very much, John. And with that, I'm afraid we're out of time. So I'll bring this event to a close by thanking all our distinguished panelists for their excellent and informative presentations and comments, and in some cases for getting up very early after a long evening's negotiations, or perhaps staying up very late at nights to join us today. And to everyone who joined this event this morning. I'm sorry we didn't have time to cover all of the questions, but please take a look at the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime's website at endwildlifecrime.org, where you can find a great deal more information about the protocol, about why we've been advocating for a protocol, and even a model as to what a protocol might look like. And hopefully answers to any of the additional questions you might have that we haven't been able to cover today. I hope it's been helpful in emphasising why this issue is so important, why it's relevant to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and the rationale for the resolution that's been under consideration and discussion in the lead up to and during this week's meeting. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a very good day. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks. Thanks, Mark.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Sandra. Thanks,
Good
Adrian.
luck for
Thanks to
today.
Cecilia.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
Cheers.
you very much.